Good evening, colleagues, students, and friends. I am Professor Erani Eramugondo, the Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation, Student Affairs and Social Responsiveness. It is my utmost pleasure to welcome you all to this UCT inaugural lecture to be delivered by Professor Shaikh, the Director of the Center for Contemporary Islam, a research unit in the Department for the Study of Religions in the Faculty of Humanities. I also wish to convey Professor Samusharela, Vice Chancellor, congratulations, I think, and also a very warm welcome to all. He would have liked to be here. He was planning to be here, but he's caught up in a finance meeting. So I'm sure you can appreciate that he'd rather be here. I'm very pleased also to welcome members of Professor Sheikh's family. We spotted them in the audience. Professor Sheikh's husband and two children and a daughter right in front. He's very proud of you. Allow me to introduce the platform party for this evening's event. Professor Shaikh, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, who will introduce Professor Shaikh. Associate Professor Fatima Sieda of the Department of African Feminist Studies in the Faculty of Humanities, who will offer the vote of thanks. Inaugural lectures are a very special event on the calendar of a university. They mark the ascent to full professorship, the highest academic rank, and one aspired to by most scholars. Appointment to or promotion to this rank constitutes recognition stature of the individual and the high quality and impact of the academic. The process leading to becoming a professor comes with its own challenges. There are many setbacks and sometimes what seem like impossible tasks. And often this is because as a university such as ours, that is research intensive, we try to balance the drive for our undergraduate students to really have a brilliant experience and succeed in the academics, while at the same time, we want to compete with only the best in the world in terms of research and studies. So carrying the double money alongside everything else that is considered quite ugly. The criteria demanding, so the rank is all the more pride. Inaugural lectures provide an opportunity to celebrate the achievements of the academic. They also provide an important opportunity for the academic to share insights into their scholarly work in a manner that is accessible to a broader audience, to tell us something of what they profess. So today you get a glimpse of what Professor Sheikh's students get to appreciate almost every day. By increasing our understanding of Professor Sheikh's work in helping to create a feminist decolonial research and teaching hub in Africa, we learn about the important interface between Islam, gender, and sexuality. Islam came to South Africa as a result of the slave trade by Dutch colonizers. I would actually say these are people who were not born slaves, but were enslaved, who were shipped to South Africa, including resistance leaders in their Southeast Asia colonies to South Africa. This included Sheikh Yusuf al-Makassari, who lived the last part of his life at Zandvliet in the Cape Colony, where he provided a sanctuary for fugitive enslaved. He established this country's first cohesive Muslim community. When he died in 1999, the area was named Makassar after his birthplace in Indonesia. The World Atlas reports that there are more than 1.7 billion Muslims around the world, with 15% or 242 million and 544. Hey. 500 in sub-Saharan Africa. Made you laugh. South Africa's Muslim population is relatively small at just 654,064. But today it's one of the fastest growing religions in the country. Muslim communities are helping to shape our South African identity. With her focused research, Professor Shaikh is providing insight into the role and influence of women in Islam. It's very appropriate for us to be listening to a topic during this month, which is Women's Month, but it's important to listen to topics such as this every day. I now hand over to Professor Shaikh.
Vice Chancellor, Professor Professor Fatima Sidak, colleagues, friends, good evening. Professor Sadia Shaikh is a phenomenon and a phenomenal feminine working in the ancient intellectual tradition of Islamism. And with a lot of religious tradition, representation of women has been contested. And the work of Professor Shaikh demonstrates gender inclusivity across the Muslim world. Professor Sheikh's work, we have learned not only of inclusivity, but the authoritative leadership of women in several rituals typically associated exclusively with men. We have been brought to feminist principles and ethics within Islam in different countries across the world, in the global north and the global south. There is an intimacy about Professor Sheikh's work that hones in on the profiles of women's lives in Islam. He blurs and blends the lines of the particular and the universal. So when she writes about women in Claremont, about a stone throw away from us, her work has an impact as far as Indonesia and the United States on either side of the globe. The deeper it goes in focusing on women's lives within the Islamic particularity, the more universal its appeal, as their plight for gender inclusive and transformative justice is a khutbah that women the world over are preaching in most institutions, not only religious ones. The work of Professor Shaikh is actional, and so is the work of the women that are humanized in her research. They are inspiring leaders, pathfinders that are occupying leadership positions with a firm determination against a torrent of stereotypes. Professor Sheikh's work and her approach is deeply transformative, not only for women, but for men as well, who are forced to change from within against their own socialization, against women's leadership. So we welcome Professor Shaikh to the lecture. As the University of Cape Town, we are extremely fortunate to have Professor Shaikh in our ranks. And as I was preparing for this introduction today, I consulted from some colleagues in her field. And the most conservative ratings, Professor Shaikh in the top 5 in the world in her area of research. While others say Professor Shaikh is one of the 2 leading scholars of Islam and gender working today. Any university in the world would be lucky to have her in the world, and this is why we pride ourselves as UCT to have her here. Her reputation internationally has seen her work forming a central part of the curriculum in universities across the world. Postgraduate students from all over the world clamour to have her as an advisor in the academic communities. These are but some of the indicators that show how valued she is as an academic inside the classroom. Outside the classroom, she's invested a lot in active scholarship with advocacy groups for marginalized women Muslims in Cape Town and across the continent. Professor Sheikh's leadership in skill building workshops has seen to the production of activist intellectual work, and more importantly, Professor Sheikh's work literally saves lives. The organization, Sister in Islam, the Inner Circle, and Positive Muslim all benefit from the publication, and her academic work is grounded and informed by insights from the marginalized Muslims that this amplifies. In the final analysis, Professor Sheikh's work speaks to the four universal values of all humanity. The voices of marginalized people in any group in the world need disciplined allies such as Professor Shaikh. Our scholarship in humanities is best represented by Professor Shaikh at its prime. The deeply appreciated theoretical contributions of her work are grounded by work with communities across the world, and she sets the standard for the rest of us to look up to. I look forward to listening to what I know will be a riveting lecture. So, Professor Shaikh, please size your moment to your opinion.
Wow. Hi. It's absolutely wonderful to see all of you here. Time is such a precious, precious thing. And so I'm truly grateful that you've all taken the time to be here. I hope you can hear me at the back, because I don't think, Kyle, that we have a microphone system. So if you can't hear me, just wave and I'll project. So I'd like to start by taking a moment to acknowledge this is a time of genocide in Barzakh. Most of us move between being overwhelmed by grief, horror, and rage at the barbaric violence unleashed by the Israeli military. Recognizing the enormity of the Nakba, or the catastrophe, we stand in solidarity with our comrades in Palestine. We pray for an end to genocide, for a free Palestine, and a just peace. Amen. So friends, I'd like to start by honoring those that are central in my life and in my work. I firstly, of course, need to recognize that I'm only here through the infinite grace of the divine beloved. In a more tangible realm, I want to thank my husband, Ashraf, whose companionship, humor, love, support have been the ground under my feet. Our regular epistemological debates and bickering is the color of life. My daughter Nuria and son Ismail make parenting an adventure and fun. Well, some of the time, that is. I'd also like to recognize my parents, my sisters and siblings, my broader family, my friends who are truly the circle of my heart as well. For making the world a place of care. I want to thank my beloved colleagues, many of whom are here today, my students who I love and who have really been a part of my growth and development, and my congregants, my fellow congregants at the Claremont Main Road Mosque, which is a space that has enabled my activist scholarship. I also want to recognize two early mentors that shaped some aspect of my academic trajectory. Professor Ibrahim Musa, who was the reason I started postgraduate studies in religion, and Professor Denise Ackerman, who first introduced me to the tools of feminist theology. In addition, Professor Amina Wadud's scholarship and person has expanded my intellectual and spiritual horizons. And my beloved sister, Fatima Sidat, whose friendship and precious intellectual companionship have been valuable. She also dresses me on many occasions. Okay, so the term Islamic feminism. So the term Islamic feminism can evoke a range of responses, and they kind of range depending on how people understand the word feminism and the word Islam. So you might find, for example, an agnostic person who's interested in the world and hears about Islamic feminism for the first time and might have a genuine curiosity. How fascinating! How does that work? And this person is intrigued by the idea of feminism within an Islamic framework. They're eager to understand how these two concepts intersect and what they might mean for Muslim women. On the other hand, so that's my stick figure on the first side. And right next on this side, you might have a staunchly secular individual on the one side, or in fact, and I'm not equating the two at all, an Islamophile, who both might have exactly the same responses, which is Islamic feminism? That's impossible. It's a contradiction in terms. They might argue that these are two inherently incompatible phenomena, and that the very notion of Islamic feminism cannot exist. Then there are those within the Muslim community who might respond with indignation, anger, or even outright rejection. Islamic feminism? What rubbish! Islam liberated women 1,400 years ago, long before the West. For them, the idea of feminism is not only unnecessary, but potentially dangerous, as it challenges their interpretation of Islam as a religion that has already provided all the necessary rights, responsibilities, and roles for women. They might emphasize traditional views. For example, they might uphold men's rights to polygyny or unequal divorce rights as fundamental and non-negotiable aspects of their faith. Finally, my jumping book. Islamic feminism. Finally, what a breath of fresh air, a language for my reality. And for these folk, Islamic feminism is a movement that speaks to the intersections of their lives and a harmonious blend of their commitment to faith and their pursuit of justice. They recognize the importance of intersectionality of oppressions and see Islamic feminism as that which uplifts their experience as a Muslim woman whose faith is an animating part of her struggle for justice in the community. So recognizing these various ways in which Islamic feminism might be engaged with in the public, let me give you a quick start-off definition of what I mean when I speak about Islamic feminism. I think of it as both a knowledge-making project and a world-making project. And it has three components. On the one hand, it refers to a rigorous critique of sexism in all its forms. Secondly, it's involved in transformative intellectual and political work. So it's about critique, it's about activity and action, and then it's based on a certain vision of reality. And that vision of reality is about justice, freedom, and these ideas of human wholeness that are part of justice and freedom are inspired by a particular religious worldview of a certain understanding of Islam, a God-human relationship, what it means to be in social relationships with others. And so knowledge, in my presentation of this and in the phenomenon as such, knowledge and activism are then integrally connected. In more recent work, I theorized Islamic feminism as a radical critical fidelity. And what do I mean by that? So it's radical in two respects, is what I'm arguing. And this phrase, I must say, was a throwaway line in Denise Ackerman's work, which I saw for the first time, fell in love with, and have decided to theorize. So my gratitude to one of my mentors. And so the idea of a radical critical fidelity is one that is defined by a radical love and commitment to the tradition, a radical commitment to being part of a tradition, to being nourished by the tradition, and simultaneously a radical critique of any form of injustice. And it's a very candid critique of injustice. So let me also add that for Islamic feminists, there's a particular view of tradition as being open, dynamic, in process. And so Islamic feminists see the past and the present as a this view of tradition. Islam as a tradition is not seen as something that's simply handed down like a baby to you. It's something that's inherited. There's a rich legacy of spirituality, of meaning making, but simultaneously tradition is open and made in the moment and in the present. At the same time, one of the major aspects that Islamic feminists focus on is the full moral agency of all believers. And given that historically much of the tradition, or at least much of the recorded tradition, has prioritized men's experiences, one of the correctives that Islamic feminism provides is to be focused on women's experience as a base to theorize and a base to make sense of the religious world. And unrelentingly, the commitment to gender and sexual justice. So that kind of gives you some of the kind of broad parameters. We'll unpack some of this in more detail. And let me just quickly say, when I speak about I've described it as a barzakhi journey. A barzakh in the Muslim tradition is that space of in-betweenness. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But let me just say what I mean by that so that the title is not mysterious. It means navigating in spaces and holding together very different intellectual traditions and spiritual vocabularies that are committed to certain values. So today, I would like to share my scholarship with you as a journey. So a journey that I've been kind of busy with for the last 2 decades. And using the language of a journey is extremely helpful. I also just want to quickly note that the idea of knowledge making as a journey is actually quite embedded in the Islamic tradition. So you might hear the term Sharia. Sharia literally means the well-trodden path to the water. So what is understood as Islamic law is well-trodden path to the water is the path, the moral laws that get you to the water of divine guidance. So the term Sharia is a pathway. The other kind of major area that Muslims, the other paths that get traversed is the path of the tariqah, the spiritual path, the path of the lovers of God that do intensive spiritual work. And this is known in Muslim tradition as the tariqah, the Sufi tariqah. That too literally means the pathways. And so this idea of knowledge as being a pathway is quite a powerful metaphor in the Islamic tradition. What I think I really want to focus on when we take seriously this idea of knowledge making as a journey is that it's movement. And it's movement through a terrain. It's movement through the seasons of life. And in the movement, the scholar is never the same from one place to the next. And the terrain doesn't remain the same. So knowledge making is dynamic, and by nature of the human existence, it needs to be something that's constantly in the process of being learned. Okay, so let's share a few stories of what has kind of located my scholarship. I generally speak very fast. My note to my students is, please do this. So let me give you that as well. Please do this. You need to slow down. So as a child, growing up in downtown Durban, Leopold Street in the 1970s, I was nurtured by a deep sense of Islamic spirituality. My father would actually often come home from work with a Cadbury flake in the one hand, and the two of us would sit down eating dinner snack, much to the chagrin of my mother and the rather clucking sounds of my grandmother, as we would sit down on a large olive green armchair, and he would regale me with stories of who would be now known as the awliya. For me, they were just really good Muslims. That is, the awliya literally translates as the friends of God, and he would tell me stories about these folk. I was fascinated particularly by Rabia al-Adawiyya. Rabia al-Adawiyya is a pre-modern Sufi woman, a slave and an ascetic. And the stories and the mythology that surrounds her were fascinating. She would apparently wander down the streets of Basra with a bowl of water in the one hand and a clay bowl of fire in the other, saying that with the water she wanted to wash away the fear of hell in the hearts of the believers, and with the fire she wanted to incinerate the passion or the lust for paradise so that worship and devotion can emerge from pure love. And then there were stories, of course, of the 19th century Emir Abdul Qadir and Nana Fatima, both in Algeria, have these beautiful, miraculous stories as spiritual savants told about them, and simultaneously were both leaders of the anti-colonial resistance to the French in Algeria. So in my childhood, the love of God was closely entwined to the love of community, and that translated into social justice. These Sufis in Muslim history were spiritual superheroes for my young imagination, and I yearned to be like them. Another cherished memory is my mum leading Taraweeh, that's Ramadan, the evening of Ramadan, there's extra prayers. And so my mother would lead Taraweeh prayers at the home, actually in our neighbor's home, for the women in the neighborhood. A beautiful recitation captured for me the transformative power of listening to the Quran and being part of a dedicated female congregation, nourished by my experiences of communal ritual. I also subconsciously internalized the idea that men owned the public system, community worship, the mosque. My religious teachers at madrasa, at religious school that I went to daily, reinforced the ideas that men were in charge religiously and God was to be feared. Fortunately, their teachings failed to affect me deeply. So fundamentally opposed were they to the experiences of my childhood home. Later on, as a young adult in a racially ghettoized urban community during apartheid, my relationship with religion became a lot more fraught because of the ways of encountering prevailing social norms that made women secondary citizens in the family and in society. Sexism intersected with racism and ethnocentrism and shadism within the community, creating a suffocating community environment in which people were simultaneously perpetrators and victims of abusive, racist, sexist hierarchies. As a young student, I rejected an Indian identity, embracing instead ideas promoted by Black consciousness. In these struggles, Islam was the matrix through which I wrestled with issues of existential purpose, spirituality, politics, human dignity, and social justice. The Quranic teaching to stand up as a justice to witness, to stand up as a witness for justice, as a witness to God for justice, was my constant guide and companion. Islam constituted the existential skin of my being, even as I grappled and struggled with what it meant to be Muslim. The anti-racist politics of progressive Muslim organizations in South Africa strengthened my vision of Islam as a religion that was at once spiritually introspective and politically active. I increasingly came to see the struggle for the quest for racial, economic, and gender justice as a religious obligation. The South African struggle I was exposed to recognized the intersection of oppression before the language of intersectionality was used in scholarship. As a graduate student, however, I begin to understand the insidious ways that patriarchy infiltrated many traditions. From Professor Denise Ackerman, and then becoming a member of the Circle of Concerned African Women Theologians, I also learned how women from diverse religious traditions resisted and instead engaged faith constructively as the foundation for justice and dignity. These were some of the formative influences in my life and inspired me to do scholarship in the area that has now come to be known as Islamic feminism. And I think it's crucial for us to recognize that all scholarly journeys are shaped by our varying communities and different intellectual traditions and political realities. Folks, hear me at the back.
Yeah.
So currently, in addition to thinking about, when we're thinking about a broader political reality, currently the global debates that frame Islamic feminism are very, very fraught. Geopolitically, particularly in the global north, there's increasing Islamophobia and anti-Muslim racism that stereotypes Islam as fundamentally violent, medieval, and especially a misogynist religion. So for Muslims committed to gender justice, the importance of holding what I call multiple critique becomes ever more important. We need to be at once critical of essentialist, racist, and Islamophobic discourses that singularly use and weaponize the so-called oppressed Muslim women on the one hand, and simultaneously remain steadfastly critical against patriarchy within our communities. And this is a delicate balance to hold in many spaces. Gender is a contested terrain. There may be ambivalent and paradoxical elements that exist within one religious tradition. And it's really important for us to recognize that in many traditions, women experience both affirming and diminishing elements. Within many traditions, on the one hand, there are central religious impulses that are deeply humanizing, that provide answers to the deepest existential questions of who am I? Why am I here? What is the purpose of my existence? Where do I go after death? Also, narratives of belonging, of community. Additionally, narratives of social justice and standing up for justice. Many Muslim women hear these and respond to these. On the other hand, there are currents that are misogynist, sexist, patriarchal, and seek to oppress women and to reduce their humanity. And women in Muslim communities, like women in other religious communities, react in a variety of ways. Some women are complicit with discriminatory practices. Some bargain and negotiate with patriarchy. Others reject religion entirely and walk away. Yet others interrogate, resist patriarchal elements while remaining practitioners and believers, forging out a crucible of faith that is on their own terms. And actually, I am drawing on the tradition. The tradition is also quite a modern thing. Now, the spectrum of ways that women relate to religion and relate to patriarchal practices is really important to recognize. This is really important to recognize. So I need to kind of make this point, particularly in the context where some kind of staunchly secular women normally dismiss all religion as indefensibly patriarchal. And when they do so, what they also end up dismissing is the ways in which religion has sustained women through some of their most grueling, painful, hard struggles in their lives. And so it's to dismiss the experience of many religious women. So in addition, it's important also for us to contextualize the study of Islamic feminism in academia, because much of the history of representing the subject in academic spaces continues to be haunted by the long shadow of Enlightenment dualisms. Since Islamic feminism is clearly and explicitly religious positioning, it challenges the secularist elephant that often stubbornly persists in the room of academia. Now, decolonial thinkers have thoroughly critiqued hegemonic secularist claims of detached, neutral, universal, and objective scholarship in the social sciences and humanities. They observe that the coloniality of knowledge has resulted in the subjugation of indigenous knowledges, including many religious worlds. Furthermore, feminist scholars have critiqued the Cartesian approaches to the human being that present the binaries of mind versus body, intellect versus emotion, spirit versus matter, subject versus object, as all of these binaries as also being enmeshed in particular kinds of gender regimes. And Enlightenment histories also contribute to the kind of binary that we often find between theology and religious studies. And so within the study of religion, there's been a number of extended debates about the problematics of subordinating religious worlds to secular conceptual categories and logics. Decolonial and feminist scholars present us, I argue, with the helpful theoretical tool of pluriversality. And my daughter said to me yesterday when I tried to give it a talk, I've never heard of pluriversality before, so let me define pluriversality. It's to recognize multiple ways of knowing and being, and to explicitly recognize that secular Western cosmology is one cosmology amongst others. And I've given you a definition just because, this is not kind of one of the more famous scholarly definitions, but I think it's quite an evocative, beautiful, creative definition. So pluriversality, in recognizing that there's a pluriverse, not just universal, the universal So it's a way of engaging diversity, diverse cosmologies, allows us to embrace a vision of the world where myriad diverse cosmologies, epistemologies, and ontologies overlap, intersect, interweave, and entwine to form a glorious tapestry of entanglement. So entanglement is often seen in quite negative terms. I kind of like what she's doing. So the pluriversal approach to the study of religion, I think, enables more welcoming spaces for understanding human beings in relation to varied religious worlds, indigenous knowledge systems, and theological perspectives that enrich understandings of the humanities and social sciences. So now, reflecting, I haven't seen anybody say this, so I think I'm going all right now. So, reflecting on some of these developments on subjectivity and epistemology, I find the Quranic concept of the barzakh quite a productive concept to work with. In Muslim thought and within Sufism more specifically, the barzakh refers to an intermediate space, a state of in-betweenness, and it draws on these Quranic verses that speak about this isthmus or this barrier between two oceans, the saltwater ocean and the sweetwater ocean. Sweetwater and the salty water. The barrier, the barzakh, signifies this intermediary world which simultaneously stands between the two, incorporates them, but does not become them. It signifies a third space that can hold things simultaneously without becoming either this or that. And so it allows us to think of embracing multiplicity more capaciously. It invites us to this third space, beyond the cruder binaries of theology versus religious studies, secular versus religious knowledge, subject versus object, mind versus heart as two different modes of knowing, scholar versus believer, activist versus academic. Resisting these binaries allows us to explore forms of scholarly production that coherently can encompass ethical reflection, spiritual yearning, intellectual unfolding, and activism for justice in cosmopolitan contexts. So now, I've done some of the kind of broad terrain setting, and I'd like to now go into the details of how I apply this to some of my own projects and my approach in Islamic feminism. So Islamic feminism is an area of transformative activism and research that has gained momentum in the last 3 decades, and it addresses important epistemological questions, which I've listed here. So what is the nature of a critical and constructive relationship to tradition? What analytical methods may be useful to understand this, to understand tradition and to engage with tradition? And more importantly, how do we then, having studied tradition critically and analytically, how do we then create and develop emancipatory horizons of imagination for religious being in the world? Asking these questions, I think, places Islamic feminists squarely within an organic genealogy of Muslim ethical debates, which have always, quite interestingly, Muslim ethical debates and philosophical debates have historically always been informed by diverse intellectual vocabularies. In the past, in the classical period, the debates in philosophy often engaged the Greek philosophies, Indian ideas of mysticism, Jewish theology. All of those were seen as intellectual or interlocutors as Muslim thinkers were developing their ideas. And so this idea of being in siloed worlds is not part of the tradition. Well, it's not part, it's one part of the tradition. Let's say, I also don't want to work with essentialisms. There's all kinds of ways the tradition can hold things. So in my own work, I draw on an established canon of feminist hermeneutics. And so I need to get my daughter to please define your term. So hermeneutics is simply how we read, how we interpret. It's an interpretive lens, right? To simplify it. So in the work that I do, I begin with what I call a hermeneutic of suspicion, or what's called within feminist hermeneutics, hermeneutics of suspicion. A hermeneutics of suspicion. It's when you're actually looking at the tradition, both in terms of the past and in terms of the current practice, and you're looking at it with a very critical eye for sexism. It's a deconstructive approach. It's kind of saying, the reality that's been presented to us presents itself as a universal, but actually it's very much based on men's experiences of the world. And so the universal that it's attempting to depict is actually a very partial, selective way of looking at the world. Let's now go. First, we need to name the stuff before we can, before we can think about alternatives. We need to be able to kind of name and shame, right? Where are the problems? Name them, because often when people, not only in terms of gender, but in a whole plethora of injustices, so much of how you experience injustice, one doesn't have a language for it. And when you don't have a language for it, you can't really attend to it. You kind of internalize it in all of these deeply problematic ways. And that's why things like Black consciousness have been so helpful for many of us to think about the ways in which we internalized racist understandings being South African. And so this idea of a hermeneutic of suspicion is really important. You need to name, very clearly identify, shine the light on things that have been kind of, subterraneanly occupying. One of the metaphors that I like to use is a gardening metaphor. Despite the fact that my husband is a gardener, I am the one that enjoys gardening, but I like watching him do it. A gardening metaphor is, I call this first process of a hermeneutics of suspicion weeding. And weeding means that you simply are taking out all the things that are sucking out nutrients from the soil, right? You're removing the things that are starving the other plants of good stuff, that's blocking sunlight, and that's greedily kind of taking up stuff. Patriarchy, I argue, and sexism and homophobia are those weeds. And so we need to be pulling away at those weeds. So I see hermeneutics of suspicion as kind of weeding. Secondly, I use hermeneutics of reconstruction. And it's an interpretive approach that is intended to uncover egalitarian approaches in the tradition, and is both a constructive and creative approach. It does two things, right? On the one hand, what you do within hermeneutics of reconstruction is you go back into the tradition. You go back into the tradition and you look for the things that have been silenced. So the historical tradition, although there's been loads of patriarchy, there's also been loads of really profoundly egalitarian histories within the tradition. Often, you never hear of these. Often you just never get to them because they're quite marginalized in the tradition. So one of the important intellectual work that Islamic feminist scholars do is to go back into the tradition to study the source text and say, oh my word, look, this exists in the tradition. And that's what I do with a lot of Ibn Arabi's work. One of the stories of retrieval that I really love is a story that's in our book on women's khutbahs. And this is the story of a woman, a pre-modern woman who, in the time of the Prophet, her name was Halwa. In the time of the Prophet, came to the Prophet and said, there was this custom. She and her husband had a tiff. He was ill-tempered. He declared this oath. It was a pre-Islamic custom where you say to your wife, you'd like the back of my mother, and then you're in limbo. You can't, the marriage is therefore in limbo, and you can't consummate the marriage. You can't return. So she went to the Prophet and she said, we both want to get back together. It's a problem. Can you do something? And the Prophet said, this is our custom. No, I really can't do anything. So what did this pre-modern woman do? He said, no, I'm not accepting that. To the highest authority, and remember, this for Muslims is the recipient of revelation, the Prophet, the authority. She says, no, I don't accept that. Sorry. Please, can you go back and ask God? And so the Prophet said, sorry. And what actually happened was the revelation of a chapter of the Quran called The Woman Who Disputes, Mujadila. What is amazing for me is that I grew up with the Quran. This chapter, The Woman Who Disputes, was right there, but it was hidden in blind sight. I mean, it was just hidden. It was hidden to me. It never occurred to me that there's a Quranic chapter called The Woman Who Disputes. She doesn't only just dispute with people around her. By virtue of an experience of injustice, she disputes with the highest authority of the time, demands that the highest authority of the time takes it to God, and God comes back and says, I have heard the woman's complaint, and provides some options. And then the whole thing gets negotiated. What I think is really profound in this retrieval is to think about this history of women in Islam contesting injustice that they experienced. And it's a history that's actually not hidden. It's pretty much in your face. I just didn't see it for like 35 years of my life, right? So the idea of not being able to see is also part of what patriarchy does to you in a particular kind of awareness, right? In a particular kind kind of communal consciousness. So this kind of retrieval is really important. It also, in some sense, it's not just that we're retrieving a woman in tradition, we're actually retrieving a modality of being Muslim, a particular kind of insubordinate subjectivity. We have a history of insubordinate. There's a load of them, by the way. The Prophet's wives were really cool. They were really snarky and really called out injustice. So we have this history. It's an organic genealogy. I call it, for Muslims in the audience, we have a silent sunnah of really powerful women. It's silenced because it's not part of what we taught, but it's part of the tradition. It's an organic part, an authentic part of the tradition, and a part of the tradition that Islamic feminists want to foreground, retrieve now, and as a model of how we can think about engaging with justice. Okay, so, and the other part of this hermeneutics is also to reimagine, and so to take not just the tradition seriously, but to think about empowering ways of making tradition in the present. What other ritual forms? What new things do we need? What doesn't attend to our needs in this time and space? And how do we create them in ways that are spiritually rich and nurturing and nourishing? And so this idea of creativity is also part of what Islamic feminists do. Okay, so let me move along, because if I give you more examples, I won't finish my paper. So let's look now specifically at 3 things that I want to talk about in my more specific research. During my early scholarship, I really wanted to understand what kinds of Muslim worlds existed for women at the coalface of patriarchy. So I did a qualitative study among South African Muslim women that were experiencing violence at the hands of their husbands in marriage. So VVV, women that in their families had been experiencing violence. My project was interested in asking the following kinds of questions, which actually I had done. Okay, so what I was interested in is what role did religion play in how women navigated their experiences of violence? How did family members and religious leaders respond to the predicament of women in violent marriages? That is, what were the governing communal religious discourses at play when, in their experience? What were the processes of meaning making and religious subjectivity for women on the receiving end of one of patriarchy's ugliest faces? I thought personally that this was going to be a weeding project, right? I thought it was a real, I was out there and I was like, what is going on here? We need to understand. It turned out surprisingly much more generative than I originally thought. My study revealed that Muslim women negotiated patriarchal power in their communities and in their family in really interesting and generative ways. Many of them, despite enormous and intense painful struggle, found that religious, or at least came to a form of religious practice that gave them strength and helped them to resist dehumanization and violent treatment. Not all of them, but a fair amount. Based on this data, I theorized the idea of a tafsir of praxis. Now, for those that don't know Muslim, that are not in the Muslim tradition, the term tafsir is generally used for a body of scholarly literature on the Quran, interpretations of the Quran. So Quranic hermeneutics, right? Interpretations of the Quran, exegetical literature by primarily elite male scholars is known as a canon of tafsir. So tafsir has this authoritative kind of weight in Muslim tradition. And so then my idea of using this term, which signifies authoritative interpretation, and to expand that to women's experience, was kind of a deliberately subversive thing of saying, well, the Quran is not simply a text that's read. It's importantly a text that's read and interpreted and done a whole bunch of linguistic work and interpretive work and making sense of that. But the Quran is a living document that has a resonance in people's lives. They take it as a living book. And so how do they live in relationship to this? And part of living at the coalface of patriarchy was my interest. And so what I then call these embodied dynamic interpretations by ordinary women was a tafsir praxis, where I intended to expand this circle of authority and interpretation. And so this created, I would argue, a more inclusive epistemology for understanding the Quran and theorizing through the experiences of a marginalized, socially oppressed group of women effectively offered a Muslim liberation theology, which has gained subsequent a currency in Islamic feminist thought and has been engaged, I think, in very wonderfully creative ways by other scholars as well. So now the study of gendered violence actually raised some crucial questions. I was troubled, for example, when I heard through my participants that I had interviewed that some religious leaders counsel them to remain within their marriages by invoking things like, by invoking particular religious virtues of sabr, patience. Be patient. This is what God wants you to do in the world, to be patient in the face of violence. Or they ask women, refer to women, oh, like, figure out how, behave in ways that doesn't provoke your husband's anger. Right? So these kind of very complicit discourses with violence, as well as they often also invoked practical legal positions that were developed in the pre-modern period as a reason to sustain what one could see very clearly as unjust practices. And in studying some of these legal practices and understanding what logic folk were using, and they were using a logic of a very particular kind of traditional thinking. Now, let me also say that for one or two of these women, they had really great imams that says, leave the bugger, just go, right? So let's not put all the imams in the same bucket, right? But by and large, women had these very problematic kinds of relationships with religious authorities. And so when I went to go and study some of these texts, what it occurred to me was that legal thinkers and this kind of traditional legal discourse often had a very problematic understanding of human nature. And I'm like, okay, I need to go and understand what is the underlying, what we would call a religious anthropology, right? So a religious anthropology asks questions. It's not the anthropology of religion, so I'm like staying here. A religious anthropology is a particular understanding of a human being that situates this human being in a religious worldview, in a cosmology where the God-human relationship is part of how the self is formed, how the human being is thought about, and the kind of location in this cosmology or in this metaphysics then defines how the human being is engaged with. And often there's a deficit in how gender is thought about when one understands and looks at some of those legal kind of discussions. So I was really then in search of a different kind of religious anthropology, and I went to look for that. I really wanted to understand where I could find the taste that I had feasted on in Sufi stories as a child, because I knew that they were there. I knew them through my experience. I knew them through actually some extraordinary human beings that I knew, men and women alike in my tradition. But I wanted to find them in the authoritative sources. So there I went. And this is how kind of it beckoned in the next phase of my research, which was a Sufi feminist theology. And this then marks my beginning of a love affair with the 13th century polymath Muhyiddin ibn Arabi, and it resulted in this first book of mine called Sufi Narratives of Intimacy. And it was exclusively derived from texts, because I was also embedded at the time. I was doing a PhD in Philadelphia and was part of a Sufi community there. And so my grappling was both textual, but also in terms of a community that seemed to have embodied some of these teachings in very meaningful ways. Simultaneously, I was reading feminist theory from South Africa, from North America. And so all of these things were part of, how I was making sense of this particular, trying to understand Sufism. And so within Ibn Arabi's work and in Sufi cosmology more broadly, I found really deep and powerful resources for thinking through a multi-layered Muslim cosmology. So Ibn Arabi does not only provide a really spiritually ripe theology and understandings of human nature and a map for cultivating love and virtue and intimacy, but he had a really profoundly egalitarian understanding of personhood and social relationships, very explicitly around gender as well. To understand my argument, so I would like folk here to stay with me patiently for the next few minutes, right? We're going to take a brief little walk into the pluriverse with Ibn Arabi's epistemology and cosmology. Try, for those of you for whom this is very foreign, try to imagine yourself entering this world, suspend your assumptions of reality and the particular secular sacred divide, and let's walk with Ibn Arabi in his universe. So my husband says I sound like him now when I get to this part. God is at once unknowable essence and knowable unknowable essence and knowable attributes. These attributes of God, the 99 beautiful names that are called in the Quran, exist in a state of unity which bring together all of the contraries in existence. The names of God range from the compassionate and the merciful in Muslim theology to the one who is overwhelming and the compeller, to the one who constricts and the one who expands, the one who is subtle, the one who is manifest and glorious, the loving, the one who afflicts you, the one who is the avenger, the one who is the forgiver. So it's the whole spectrum of human existence. I put down, I don't know if you can see it that far, but all of the 99 names. Now, this 99 attributes of God are divided by Muslim theologians into two groups: names of beauty or mercy on the one hand, and names of majesty or power or wrath on the other hand. However, the Quran itself and Muslim theology itself gives a priority to the names of mercy or beauty, right? So many of you might have heard Muslims invoke Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah, for short. In the name of God, it means in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. It's not just a formula that Muslims invoke. In the Quran itself, 113 of the 114 chapters begins with the invocation of the two names of God, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, the compassionate, the merciful. It comes from the root womb, Rahm, womb, right? So this idea of mercy and compassion as being primary, and of course in the Muslim tradition, there's also the saying that my mercy overcomes my wrath. So this idea of an ontological priority to mercy in the divine is very much part of the Muslim tradition. Now, within this theology, human beings are seen as the reflection or the embodiment of divine attributes. We are all, in fact, walking microcosms of the divine attributes in this theology, right? The divine discloses herself through the divine names in creation. And the purpose of human life is to do the work of cultivating the heart so that you balance and you calibrate these divine attributes that are gifted to you. And when you calibrate them to the perfect level, when you become one of the friends of God, then the calibration is so perfect that the spirit shines fully through this human being. And so the qualities, now let me just say here that in Sufi mappings, the idea that God says, my mercy overcomes my wrath, is also seen as a pedagogy for human beings, right? So to cultivate the qualities of beauty are actually primary. This is not to dismiss the powerful qualities, they're really important, but they have to be defined in the crucible of love and mercy. And so the balance between them is what I have taken these theological ideas and imperatives of the divine human relationship into the social realm to develop the Islamic feminist ethics of care, mutuality, justice, and which inform some of my theorizations that I'm going to return to shortly. But I want to remain with Ibn Arabi and Sufi theology just a little more. Thank you for your patience. You've been very good with my Imam hat, okay? He's subject to secular cosmology that he thinks it's an Imam hat. It's really, it's not just weird, this happens all the time. So I want to remain in Sufi theology. God's self-disclosure in existence in Sufi theology is ongoing and never repeats itself. Simply said, the divine is never the same in every moment. From one breath to the other, the face of the divine is shifting. Here I suggest that if God's relationship to creation is never the same from one moment to the next, the spiritually healthy human being is the dynamic site of receptivity to the changing face of the one. From this vantage point, we engage notions of God as dynamism and difference, and the divine human relationship is an intimate process characterized by perpetual transformations. Such a theology of dynamism demands an epistemology on the move, an openness to transforming and transformative knowledge. It offers a vital living theology that is premised on an open, itinerant concept of God, of subjectivity, and of gender. With each breath, human beings receive the continuous divine invitation to become. The theology of dynamism is not only about a God who holds difference within oneness, but a God who can be best discerned through receptive, spiritually supple human beings. For Islamic feminists, these concepts of relationship, I think, are deeply productive about the innate fluidity of human beings. If we are indeed sites of constant divine disclosure, our understandings of sexuality and gender would be best served by being open to flux, to diversity, and to inclusiveness. Humanity and our genderedness and our sexual identities resist complete knowability. When while a person might know themselves with some level of certainty in a present moment, other moments might reveal other forms of self-knowing, unveiling, and transformation. All forms of human subjectivity, and thus conceptions of gender and sexuality, are provisional and fluid. So such theological conceptions at the heart of Sufism, for me, provide rich resources to think of gender as a spectrum and sexual diversity as reflective of this kind of theological openness. So, next, thank you. We're now just going to take the implications, but thank you for staying with me. So, building on Sufi mappings of the self, I have developed a critique of the foundations of patriarchy based on Islamic cosmology. Applying central Sufi principles, Sufi psychology, I argue that patriarchy, as well as racism, homophobia, or any other logic of domination that privileges a particular group of people based on social identity, feeds the lower qualities of arrogance and egotism, creating idols of certain kinds of human subjects while diminishing other lives. For Muslims in this audience, I argue that patriarchy is the nafs al-ammara writ large, or the lower self writ large, on the social landscape, resulting in destructive relationships of power in the social group. My argument is not that these only result in outer injustice, which is contrary to Islamic ethics, but that these forms of power are theologically problematic and spiritually damaging to the community at large. Finally, I provide, in Sufi cosmology, I provide a structural critique of sexist Muslim personal laws, arguing that, in fact, discriminating legal systems are based on underlying problematic understandings of human nature that are used by many classical Muslim jurists and traditional jurists that draw on these sources unthinkingly. So the ideas of personhood reflect patriarchal lenses rather than a robust theological understanding of personhood. Now, I'm actually going to skip to an example because I think I've got stuff that scholars would quite like. But what I mean by this is simply to say that let me use an example of my dude from the 13th century, Ibn Arabi, right? So he actually has this really interesting position that many contemporary Muslims think of as anathema, right? He has the position that he's stated very clearly that women can lead men and women in communal prayer. And his argument is just not that it's egalitarian or that it's a nice thing to do or that it's cool. The argument he makes is that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, attested to the spiritual capacities of men as he did of women. And therefore, women can lead men in prayer. And so his logic, the kind of logic he's using, is he using and deeply unearthing the kind of underlying religious anthropology, the assumptions of the self, and then saying, well, that has a direct relationship to the ways in which legal thinking must unfold. And so when, this the kind of movement, you're going to hear a little bit more about the book on women's footwears and sermons, when one hears these ideas that, often the criticism is that, you Islamic feminists, this is from within the community, right? You just want to be like those Western feminists out there. Actually, no, there's a really interesting genealogy of particularly these positions in the 13th century, long before many other communities were thinking about it. Okay, so we're not going to do that complicated thing, right? So, some of the ways I've engaged with Ibn Arabi's remarkable theological imaginary as a means to retrieve and foreground an Islamic tradition of creativity and boldness. If one reads Ibn Arabi through a decolonial feminist lens, he provides productively a more pluriversal history of imagining gender fluidity. He provides Islamic feminists with an indigenous archive of troubling gender in ways that are deeply enmeshed in a Muslim cosmology that can participate in broader theoretical dialogues with other worldviews and other paradigms, seeking to destabilize gender hierarchy. So, and here I want to say, instead of seeking freedom and liberty only in the ineffable realms of the spiritual, my reading of Ibn Arabi encourages us to seek continuity and congruence between theological and spiritual perspectives on human nature and practical demands for social and legal equality. And this now leads me to the last development in my scholarship. And I need to briefly zigzag back in history to 1990. Right? And this was, of course, the year of our democratic moment, and it was a formative experience for me belonging to the activist Claremont Greenwood Mosque. Alongside the very exuberant national narratives of freedom and equality, our congregation, under the courageous and visionary leadership of Imam Rashid Umar, invited a female feminist theologian and scholar of the Quran, Professor Amina Wadood, to give the Friday khutbah or sermon, subsequently called the pre-khutbah, but that's another discussion. Arguably, this is the first time, at least in the modern period, because actually there's pre-modern precedents for this, but that's also a story of time, that a woman had given the sermon in a mosque in front of a mixed gender congregation for the Friday Jumu'ah service in the world. Her erudite and really compelling sermon was actually about using the image and the metaphor of pregnancy and birthing as ways to think about the surrender about surrender to God. And so she used a very embodied female's experience to teach the entire community about what surrender to God would be like. I remember just being completely blown away, thinking that I'd come out of the shadows into the sunlight when I heard this for the first time. Now, I've argued that this bold initiative, enabled by our local community and with her leadership, catalyzed the beginning of a global movement for inclusive leadership in communities that has gained incredible momentum in the last 3 decades. As a community aside, because there's so many wonderful communities, you know, many people would say, oh, the Claremont Main Road Mosque, they've been doing this for, 3 decades now, but really there are not many other masjids in the area that have ever taken on this impetus of having women that, that give sermons or that give talks at the mosque. In fact, the mosque has had a really extraordinary impact globally. And so I think that if we widen our gaze, in my view, I would argue that this small masjid congregation of activists and amazing human beings catapulted a global movement. So the fruition and the culmination of this revolutionary South African moment is captured in this first collection, this co-edited collection of women's sermons, conceptualized by Professor Sedat and myself, called the Women's Khutbah Book, Contemporary Sermons on Spirituality and Justice from Around the World. This volume comes from Cape of South Africa, Denmark, Senegal, Mexico, the US, Egypt, Indonesia, amongst other places. And it's the first ever collection of women's sermons, which expands the possibilities of inclusive communal and ritual leadership in ways that were thought quite impossible by many Muslims. The book is really interesting because it offers fresh theological insights and deep ethical responses to the contemporary period. What I also think is very helpful in this book, that together with our project manager, Rushila Naya, Fatima, and myself also decided that we would put templates for women to write khutbahs, because women are not schooled. You're not supposed to be writing khutbahs, so you're not schooled in how to do it. And so this idea to create templates at the back of the book to say, if you were thinking of writing a khutbah, here's how you do it. The collection includes biographical reflections by each of the contributors, poetry and storytelling. And so Fatima and I, when we theorize this, we say that it moves us from a tafsir of praxis to a tafsir of possibility. What was previously unthought, can now come into fruition. What's been most heartening about this book is that we've had people from all over the world write to us. They've created reading groups, they've invited us to them, they've created their own communities. They're using the book both as a sermon book, but also as an opportunity to create communities. And so the social impact of this particular work and the way in which it is really amazing. The amazing contributors. We have 23 extraordinary women in this collection. All right, so I'm going to conclude shortly. I thank you for your patience. Having done over 2 decades of scholarship, my most recent work describes Islamic feminism as a friendship within tradition. The idea of friendship is really kind of central in Islam. God in the Quran is described as the divine friend, al-wali, The friends of God, the most spiritually accomplished folk in Sufism are called the awliya Allah, the friends of God. The believers, men and women, are described as protecting friends of awliya of one another, who serve as moral agents in the world doing the public good. And so I think that this idea of friendship enables us to move from a hierarchical kind of relationship to a more reciprocal, mutual relationship of thinking with and through the tradition. And so I think of friendship also as a journey. And so I'd like to come back to the idea of journey, and I'd like to conclude with reading a poem by the 13th century Sufi Jalaladdin Rumi, with translations done by the dear brother of mine, Safi. And it's called Mi'raj. The Mi'raj is the heavenly ascension when the Prophet Muhammad ascended into the heavens. So let me read it for you. Radical love is an ascension, taking us to the roof to rendezvous with the Sultan of beauty. Read on a lover's face the tale of this rising. May our souls, our intellectual work, and our service in this life become tales of ascension. Thank you.
Claudia, I hope you share my invitation to everyone in the audience to gate crash your lectures. I now call upon Associate Professor Fatima Siadat to give a response. And of course, those of you who are still wondering why we can't have mics in this room, it's impossible to have mics. The design with those mics on the ceiling, which makes this the best venue for live streaming.
I am going to try. You can tell me if I'm not loud enough. And my dear Professor Sadi. I begin with a quotation. Friendship offers an archetypal model for relationship to the real. And pursuing this relationship assists the believer in attaining the ultimate ends of Islam.
I'm here.
Can't hear. I can't see your voice. Spiritual refinement is contingent on forms of friendship, and the cultivation of spiritually imbued friendships in the social world simultaneously nourishes friendship with the divine friend, Al-Wali, while allowing us to give form or social reality to this innate divine quality of friendship lodged within the human heart. This is a quote from a 2023 article by Professor Shaikh entitled Friendships, Fidelities, and Sufi Imaginaries, Theorizing Islamic Feminism. It is truly an honor and a privilege to speak in response to Professor Sadia Sheikh's inaugural lecture. And how about to feel honored when a scholar who theorizes friendship amongst the ideal social and divine relationships for justice then also calls you friend. Now, friendship indeed goes back to high school. Durban Indian Girls High was one of the first few of its kind. I'd often after school bump into Sadia on Leopold Street. We'd make our way to the next street over. Sadia's family lived in a flat above the shops on Leopold Street. And my father had a shop, a video rental shop in one of the arcades on Leopold Street. And we'd make our way to the end of the next street to a shop called Taj Company. Taj Company sold the freshest boar, sour, black, brown little fruit that the old people cautioned if we ate too much, we dry our blood. Thinking back now, I realized their concerns were deeper than we knew. That your blood in a young girl's life means you are healthy, you menstruate, you possibly have children. We were clearly more interested in the way the sour, dark fruit made our toes curl. And then our next encounter was at UCT as master's students when I got to share her digs for a semester or two. And then we went our separate ways again. Until one day, while I was doing my PhD, I found a call for a special volume that Professor Shaikh was editing. I put aside my writing insecurities. I took courage. I submitted a paper that had emerged while I was reading for my comprehensive exams. The response had me enraged. Don't know if I told you this stuff. She rejected my paper. The comments landed on the most sensitive bits of my PhD student self. Who did she think she was? I complained terribly to my colleagues, and being good feminists, they both joined me in my rage and then gave me perspective. When we wrote the Women's Khutbah book together, I learned about how Professor Shaikh writes. And the best way to explain it to you is to ask you to imagine a jeweler fashioning a chain of exquisitely fine beads. Sadia formed each bead carefully, with precision. Based on the material she's working, she chooses the ideal form of the sentence, gives it a solid beginning, chooses the exact adjective or three. Slowly, she works toward a beautiful finish, and she adds luster with more polish. This happens time after time after time until a paragraph, a chapter, a book is complete. Each sentence is fashioned perfectly as it's written. The revisions only make it more so. The embellishments add clarity, depth, vision, so that eventually the exquisitely fine chain of beads can be taken up, placed over your own hand, draped on your neck, or wherever else the impact of those thoughts are destined to go. So it is these fine, lace-like threads of conceptual work that bring me to Professor Sheikh's intellectual impact in the field of Islamic studies. In the 90s, when no one else was doing this, Sadia Shaikh was taught by one of the great feminist theologians of our context, Professor Denise Ackerman. Under her tutelage, our Professor Shaikh found fresh tools to bring to our own concerns about ethics and justice in religious community through the works of Rosemary Radford Ruser and Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza. And so Professor Shaikh was among the first scholars, if not the first, to repurpose feminist theological tools to think about pietistic experiences of Muslim women. Applying the hermeneutic strategies of close reading of the text in context, Professor Shaikh was able to discern the ways in which women produce their own experience-based meanings of the text. Her master's findings, published in 2007, show the conclusions of the tafsir of practice, which is her unique contribution, where she discerned a hermeneutic of being in the world and a commitment to simultaneously being in the text, with a constant to and fro through which meaning is made. And then, in the impetus of her work, I find Professor Shaikh mirrors somewhat of bell hooks, whose confession opens the first chapter of her book, Teaching to Transgress. Their hooks reveals the drive that often resides behind many of our intellectual endeavors. Bell Hooks says, I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing. Between bell hooks and Sadia Shaikh, we see the value of the personal in the pedagogic, the location of ourselves and our personal endeavors in our theoretical and conceptual journeys, as we strive to make meaning. Sadia was also amongst the first scholars who claimed Islamic feminism for herself as a theoretical location. And for those that know us both, and know the field of Muslim feminist thought, you will also know that we have some differences of opinion here as to how Islam and feminism converge. While Professor Shaikh is comfortable in Islamic feminism, I find more comfort in Muslim feminism. Semantics, you might say. But for those of us in the business of trading words and ideas, we know the matters at stake are significant. More significant than our differences, though, are the ways in which Professor Shaikh has articulated an analytic method for Islamic feminism. And this is truly valuable for scholarship. Firstly, and I'll go through the 3 points of the method that she's articulated. Firstly, as a critical deconstruction of traditions that are patriarchal, androcentric, and homophobic. The next step, she's told us this already, I'm simply recapping. The next step after the deconstruction is the retrieval, the recovery, and the making visible of marginalized histories and practices, and foregrounding gender egalitarian narratives from within the history and current practice. Remember the women who argued, the women who disputed. And the third step is the reconfiguration, the reimagination, and the re-envisioning of core theological and ethical categories in ways that are inclusive of all people, egalitarian and spiritually vivifying. This work began in an article that is likely her most read, her chapter from 2003 in Progressive Muslims, where she outlined how her commitment to Islamic feminism arose through her own anti-apartheid work. And in this way, Saadiya is part of a larger movement of progressive Muslim thought, which has deep roots in South African soil. The convergence of our unique histories of religion, enslavement, coloniality, and apartheid have also been the source of radical commitments to social justice. The idea of the gender jihad, for example, emerges in South Africa through the work of our own Dr. Imam Rashid Umar of the Claremont Main Road Mosque, alongside intellectuals like Ibrahim Musa, Abdul Qadir Tayyib, Farid Essak, Farida Mohammed, Tahir Sitoto, Lubnan Nadvi, Isa Al-Sefer, Ofela Mfutlan. In this context, Professor Shaikh offers the much-needed analysis of gender that goes beyond the recognition of what men owe to women. Through her work, we find tools drawn from within the scholarship and ethical traditions within Islam for understanding gender as one amongst many other differences. And for this, she prompts a shift from the external indices of social belonging, such as race, gender, class, religion, and sexuality, toward the internal self-regulating indices of personal refinement, so that we each become responsible for how we understand these social indices. We learn through her that the social indices of hierarchy are not spiritually healthy. What is important is how the higher virtues allow us to engage in the realm of the social and towards the social good. Calling out prejudice and injustice is a demand of the refined soul makes upon the lower self. Justice is the realization of spiritual and ontological equality, where, and I quote, every human being is recognized for having equal access to an inherent spiritual capacity. Anibal Quijano has long theorized the ways in which coloniality and race function on the idea that some people don't have souls. Shaikh makes the soul inherent to every person, apportioning full humanity to each of us. And for those who choose to claim that soul aspect of ourselves, she makes us responsible for its cultivation. Finally, we are grateful for the theoretical tools for understanding gender outside of essentialist categories. Saadiya Shaikh offers a path of liberation from restrictive gender molds without simply saying, and I quote, without simply saying that gender does not exist. It does and it does not, she says. Some of us old enough will recall that once Judith Butler also made us uncomfortable when she told us that sex was no more discursively constructed than gender was. Saadiya removes the stability of the material body from our categorizations of gender, suggesting that these categories are themselves fluid. Indeed, as the self is constantly becoming, so is our gender. The yes and no position that Professor Shaikh theorizes allows us to break free from the idolatry of the reified and fixed category of gender. toward the experience of gender in various forms and ways along the path. I would be remiss to end the presentation without also pointing to the ways in which Professor Sheikh's work is now canonical in the field. Open most any discussion on Islam and gender, and there you'll find her alongside Amina Wadood, Asma Barlas, Rifat Hassan, Ziba Mir Husseini, Aziz Al-Hibri, all scholars of significant repute and impact. Aisha Hidayatullah, professor at University of San Francisco, in her Feminist Edges of the Quran, includes Sadia Shaikh amongst her analysis of the ways in which Islamic feminism may or may not be sufficient for Muslim women's aspirations for equality. Faqih Abdul Qadir, who is at the Faculty of Islamic Law at Sheikh Nurjati State Institute for Islamic Studies in Indonesia, analyzes her work as an application of Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics. Zahra Ayubi cites her amongst the canonical tradition of Islamic feminists in her Gendered Morality, a study of classical Islamic ethics and theories. Kirsten Wisselhoff, professor at Vassar College, New York, includes Sufi narratives of intimacy amongst 3 other works on gender and sexuality in the Islamic tradition. And Mulki Sharmani at University of Helsinki, most recently, is in the process of publishing a review of approaches to Islamic feminism, amongst which is Professor Sheikh's. Importantly, too, her approach, her work is used a lot in activist work. Musawa's publications regularly publish work by Professor Shaikh, and her tafsir of praxis is influential in the reform work of South African Muslim women reformists, namely the Muslim Personal Law Network. In its earlier stages, Professor Sheikh's work was also informed Muslim youth movement's gender desk. The list goes on, but I will stop. Because this reminds us that Sadia, Professor Shaikh, is indeed a friend along the path. Her writing has initiated a whole generation and re-educated many older generations about inner refinement work as a path to social justice. Just a scholar, friend, I look forward to the gems you will fashion for us in the future. May the alchemy of your mind and your heart to identify our challenges and carefully mold beautiful solutions endure always. May your capacity to fashion together justice and beauty, the other wal ihsan, grow and keep us guided always. Thank you, Professor Sadia.